Hello. This is episode 3 of Composting Whiteness, and I am in a different place than my previous videos, but I felt like it was important to share this around what's coming up. As we have seen, and as you've walked with me through the first 2 episodes of the Composting Whiteness series, I've outlaid just to a small degree what how whiteness is a grooming by the grotesque. That when we change the language around whiteness, white privilege, white supremacy, we get closer to the function of what these things actually do, not just on the physical level, but also on a metaphysical or spiritual level, on a more than just the body level. And this is where the framing of whiteness as a grooming by the grotesque comes in. Now, the grotesque, we've already said, for those of us who are living in colonized places, settler colonial societies that have been colonized by Western European powers, we are talking about specifically a system of colonization that has white supremacy as its fundamental foundation, and how it has exchanged with the world, and how and the peoples around the world it encountered. In this encounter during the spread of Western European empire, as an outgrowth of the spread of empire within European territories itself, this system of domination and hierarchy, land extraction, spiritual epistemological war, right? Continued to happen, a war on empire thinking versus those who lived in accordance with the land, who lived in smaller societies, who had different spiritual practices. We see that there's this consolidation of power that begins to happen, and it becomes stratified from group to group across time, right? We have this empire here kind of merging here, but what we know about this period of Europe is that empire has as some foundational ways that it maintains the power of a select elite, whether this is by because the development of a noble class, right, that trickles down into a feudal society, that also gets stratified by calling certain people or certain peoples from certain regions, also certain professions, as being a lower class, this practicing of a hierarchy to consolidate power and keep power consolidated, has as its basis the extraction also of the earth and people and the labor of peoples, where some benefit and those um, who are not in the position to benefit, who are considered less than human, receive a pittance. And in this society, in these societies, in the outgrowth of this new thought, we have some very particular gods and ways of viewing the world that arise, that do start to position the physical world and the spiritual world as separate, start to position man above the natural world, which many of the societies prior to these empires around the world did not conceive of such a system as that. And this this ideology is more than just a thought pattern. It is reinforced through extreme terror and violence. It is enforced through war. It is enforced through um, siphoning of rights. It's enforced through a lot of violence, a lot of trauma. It's enforced through genocide. It's enforced through the destruction of spiritual systems and knowledge systems, the destruction of languages, the destruction of humans, family connections, the separation of families, the separation of families from land and spirits of these lands, separation of a people from a story that gave them a sense of home and belonging. What we find is the outgrowth of empire has as its fundamental basis a strong and pervasive disconnect through violence and trauma from connectivity, where then what has been given up, what's been lost in the hearth, right? We know that they burned libraries in Mali at Timbuktu. This destruction of knowledge, which is the story of a people and how they know the world and how they see themselves embodied within this larger world, how they view what they have to offer to their people, who they define as their people, who they define as community, all gets lost and subsumed into a system that then categorizes people according to how they can be best extracted from. It is entirely grotesque. Some of the grotesque things we know because scholars have reconstructed this when it encounters, let's say, natives of Turtle Island and African people through the African slave trade. What do we mean? What's in the grotesque? Well, we have documented evidence that slaveholders would eat enslaved people, that European colonists in Africa would also eat their prisoners, their slaves. We know this. This is documented. There is a book called The Delectable Negro that goes into this, right? We know that they were boiling uh, African descendant people in chattel slavery system, boiling them using the oil to make products, using their skin, using their teeth, using their hair to fill furniture into stuffed chairs. These are very grotesque systems. We know in the case of Mary Turner, an enslaved woman whose husband was killed in a lynch mob, that when she protested, she was, I think, 8 months pregnant, and the baby was cut out of her belly. This is grotesque, and she was hung. This is very grotesque behavior. Um, we know that African descendant babies were fed to alligators. We know that these systems use the very communities, people from these communities, to enforce unthinkable acts of violence against their own peoples. We know that this is part and parcel of the grotesque society. We look at it, people refer to it as an Epstein class, but what I'm saying is it's not just relegated to an Epstein class. This is the very bedrock of society, that eating people, oppressing people to such a degree that we dehumanize them and devolve them into animals. The fact that humans were considered on a ledger as property that can be mortgaged, that can be inherited. And we know that white women were very prominent slaveholders during chattel slavery in the United States because of their proximity to white men through marriage and through paternal inheritance, that white women were also part and parcel of this grotesque system that we know as anti-blackness. We know that there are laws, like in Virginia, there were laws around not being able to just kill enslaved African children with impunity because of how often it was happening, perpetrated by white women who were slave owners. We have the documentation, we have the firsthand stories of fugitive slaves who found freedom in northern territories and were able to tell the horrors of what they had seen and experienced. This is documented, this is the grotesque, and this is what has been kept. But what we don't often talk about, which I've said in previous videos, is what was happening in Europe that gave rise to a system that could do and enact this type of barbarism on African descendant peoples, had its start and its evolution within Europe itself, and its destruction of the peoples of Europe, and how it codified who was a barbarian or who was considered, having the noble right to rulership and land ownership. And that this ideology spread, which would mean that the trauma of disconnection happened well before what we know of contemporarily as whiteness came into being. That in Europe, there was already this deeper grapple about who gets to be human and who gets to be treated as animal. Now, the characteristics for how that changed and evolved changed over time, and that's a very complicated, interconnected story of its evolution. However, what we do know is that the peoples who lived according to and in relationship with the land had a different set of relationship and relational practices that beyond extraction found themselves in their societies, their systems of knowing and knowledge burned and destroyed and replaced with having to have an identity as somebody a part of a class, a kingdom, an empire, and then a nation state. This is all maintained through egregious acts of violence. In this disconnection from land and stories and histories, it creates a homelessness, and trauma creates a dissociation from the body itself. as a protective mechanism. So, what we have at large is a system that has disconnected the globe at large from a sense of home and belonging. And now, the hearth of where we receive that belonging is now given to us mostly through the nation state and through race, through class, through caste, through color. It's given to us through hierarchy instead of reciprocal relationalities. And in this type of a system, our need for belonging has us trapped, perpetuating and living within and navigating systems that were never designed for us to thrive. This is grotesque. If you're here, it's because you believe that there is an alternative way. Now, I have talked at length on Instagram about the ways in which I grew up and why I have such an intimate, embodied knowledge of whiteness. So I grew up in a Christian, conservative, Republican household. And what comes with that is a Western hegemony, which positions Western thinking, Western society, Western ideals as the height, Western European ideals as the height of civilization, and then positions that if these people are the height of civilization, everyone else is primitive and less than human until they become proximus to this vision of whiteness, which in our Western European influenced societies is white and gendered. It's racial and it's gendered. It's white men are considered the top. Now, next, underneath that, under whiteness, we have a stratification where whiteness is created with at its very bottom anti-blackness. So the adopting of whiteness inherently is an anti-blackness that furthers all of the grotesque actions that we spoke of that have literally fueled and funded global capitalism and in particular grown American society at large. No system, no infrastructure in America that has grown into this nation we call America is not directly tied to the lost stolen wages and to Black folks as actual property that can be mortgaged, lent against, and the government subsidies and bailouts that have occurred since that were given to white peoples. This is not just slavery. This is the carceral justice system, allowing slave labor, allowing corporations to buy labor. This is convict leasing system, which came right after enslavement, which allowed the state to profit from creating criminal laws expressly designed to put Black people back in slavery because slavery was made legal through the Constitution and not rendered illegal. It was made legal in cases of crime. So crime became super important. We see this by knowing that not just a racial wealth gap that hasn't closed in 126 years, but that the largest transfer of wealth occurred during COVID, where 99% of the people have 1% of the wealth, and 1% of the wealthy own and have access to 99% of the wealth across racial lines. This is grotesque. Growing up in a home, all I would learn through Christianity and white Christian male rhetoric is all of the propagandizing that creates the cultic thinking that insulates us from being able to directly check or contradict the belief systems that give rise to such a stark, unequal distribution of wealth and power. That means that certain people's lives are continuously in danger or not able to access life affirming food, water, because of the color of their skin and their gender and their sexuality. And when these are stratified together, when these are placed together, then we have multiple sections of empire all coalescing to make some people's lives difficult, the conditions of their lives extremely, extremely difficult. Now, the important thing is in the deconstructing of what is essentially cultic programming, many people don't know what that looks like. What does it look like to deconstruct out of these cultic systems of thinking? Number one, and these are in no particular order, and you should also know that these stages are not linear, that you will have to go back and revisit these stages as you continue to grow. But one stage that's important is the intellectual. The first thing that happened to me is I began to learn histories that were hidden from me. I got access to scholars, documentation that was showing me a different picture than what I was hearing on Christian talk radio. On Christian talk radio, I was learning about how these systems, how American nationalism, American electoral politics. I was learning about democracy being good for us, how we were moving the needle forward. I was learning that God blessed this nation, God wanted this nation. I was learning so many things that were in direct contradiction, not just to the religion I believed myself a part of, but to the idea of America as a good father and the Christian God itself as another good father, and that these two fathers are nearly the same father or emanations of this father. I had to read the scholars, I had to read the history, I had to read the information that was kept out of reach of me and start to ask new questions. There is so much documentation around what has really occurred in American history. And books like the 1619 Project, books like The Delectable Negro, books like so many, there are so many texts reading slave narratives. There are so many texts that help us to understand. Reading The Racial Wealth Gap by Mirza Baraduran give us a true context of the moment that we're in and how we may have arrived here. That is important, but it's not the end. And many people, if they get stuck here, they forget that when you have a worldview, the issue is not just your view about the world, but your identity self is how you believe you exist in the world that you know. In a white supremacist world, our ontology, our belief about ourselves, who we know ourselves to be, is given to us in relationship to the values of the dominant society. When you change the ways in which you hold what the world is at large, the ways in which you know yourself to be also must change, which includes practice. We practiced an embodiment in a world. Up until 19 years old, I had practiced an embodiment in a world where I truly believed that God would bless this nation if I voted against gay people having rights to marriage. That was a very particular identity self that I had. That when I learned new information and learned the true origin of the gender binary as I knew it, as I learned the true orientation around how these political parties were leveraging this this fear around changing cultural narratives and the fear it was engendering using different marginalized communities as a scapegoat, then who I knew myself to be and how I acted had to change to match. I had to practice a change in language. I had to practice a shift out of previous biases that I had held. As they would continuously get exposed, I would have to confront them, metabolize them, and shift them. And that is a practice. And it's a practice that involves getting in the ring with new people. And one cannot deconstruct whiteness when I think it's over 70% of white people in America do not have a close and personal Black friend. There is no way to deconstruct because the blind spot you have does not give you the lens in which to see it because it is a blind spot. No cult gives you and teaches you the tools to deconstruct the cultic programming because it wouldn't be a cult if it did. And if these systems operate like a cult, you cannot use the glasses of the cult to see the cult. You would have to find new glasses in which to view it. And many, I see a difficult part is that many people are too afraid to cause harm to get into the ring, but it is relationality that we are returning back to. It was returning back to a relationality outside of the racial paradigm that we've been given. And anytime we are in relationality, this is a place where we have to find people who want to consensually be in relationship with us. And this involves a struggle and a vulnerability, which brings me to the second part. The second part of the work is what I'm talking about, is the practicing, the embodiment, the putting it into practice. You have to practice a new way. You have to emerge a new being. Your identity self must change. Now, in ritual with Elder Malidoma Somé, the indigenous African societies offer many technologies for what it means to step across the threshold, right? Which for me included a naming ceremony. Now, in the West, we don't have ceremonies and rituals to honor a crossing. And this is where moving your idea around liberation and deconstruction away from the Western society into a different modality becomes the lens that you need to look back at this society as a whole. A big part of the embodiment was that I had to find another cultural home to belong to. I had to give up a home. And for a time, I wandered and found my home in indigenous African belief and cosmology, because there I had a lens, I had a home, and I no longer needed, as Dr. Maulana Karenga said, I was a student at Cal State Long Beach while he was chair, but I would always remember him saying, when you are clothed in your own culture, then you can show up to the table, right? To the table of cultural exchange like a buffet, not, but you're not starving. You can show up to exchange, but you're not starving. When we are disembodied and disconnected by these grotesque systems, often we are starving, and we are very susceptible to finding home, even if the homes we find are homes that only become homes to us because of their exclusion of others. And often we don't want to give up that feeling of belonging, of exclusive belonging that makes us feel important in a society that continuously, perpetually devalues us. So relationality becomes important, learning how to be back in relationship. And this relationship does include the spirits of the lands and waters. It does include ancestors, not ghosts, not dead ones, ancestors, the wise ones who walk with you. The remedy, the medicine is in the wound. This is what Elder Malidoma teaches from, he's a Dagara shaman, that the medicine is in the wound. If the wound is identified as disconnect, then the medicine is reconnection. But we have to know then, what is the reconnection to? When we know, then we come to the third point, is when you learn that these systems have disconnected you from body, from home, from belonging, from history, from origin story, from beauty, from thriving. What you have then is grief. And many of us also have shame, because we've blamed ourselves for being poor within a capitalist system, for being viewed as ugly within a fat phobic system, for viewing ourselves as undesirable or worthless within colorist and gendered systems. And when we realize that this was all an outgrowth of a lie, there's often a massive amount of grief and reworking around shame, the ways in which we have blamed and internalized and become our own cops and police officers, the ways in which we've pathologized our own need for belonging, and the ways in which we've come into sick families and communities who have been so traumatized that they could not offer us the home and belonging that we all deserved. The immense amount of grief is actually a place where we can powerfully connect to ancestors, powerfully connect to nature. But the grief is something that never ends. The grief is what allows us to no longer protect an identity that is built on harm and trauma and dispossession of others and ourselves. And the grief is what we use to water a new embodiment and the seeds for a new world. And bringing the ancestors into that process of grief and allowing them to assist us in holding and transmuting it as a water allows us to reconcile histories and stories that are otherwise irreconcilable. The tension that comes between the truth and the lies we've given is often so much that if we were to be rigid, we might break. The water can come through, as the saying, water has no enemies. The water can come through and make space in between tight spots where no other element can. So the grief, the water work, returning to care with the spirits of the waters of our people's lands, all of these things, bringing this grief to the ancestors to hold with us is part of how we stay supple enough to shift, to change. This is how we pursue now reconciliation and repair versus shame. Shame is a water that's been dammed, but grief is a water that flows and where it touches makes the land fertile for planting. The fourth thing that became important to me, and this process now we're talking, I don't know, maybe I started at 18 and now we're talking at 32, really getting into ancestral work, really getting into the places in which there has been so much migration and loss, ancestors unnamed and unclaimed, and finding my rooting now in a larger continuity of memory that had previously been broken, either by enslavement, and for some of you, it's by colonization, erasing the larger stories and the languages. So now there's only the nation state where you should have found homes and hearths and fires, languages and peoples and stories. And what we find is building empire, road, and no history of our wise ones. The ancestral work of reconnection with just our lineages becomes important because that becomes part of the repair. It's part of the way that we are guided into the reconstruction of what was taken and what was lost, and helps us in repairing the world. Because in the tradition that I learned and studied, the Dagra tradition, the role of the ancestors is not to tell you what to do, it's to be here to support. That we call in the ancestors as our community, our beloved kin who have been lost to us. We call them in to say, come back and join our community. Come back and offer your medicine into this community. And now you will come back and help restore that which you broke. You will assist me in the repair because I have a duty not just to this moment, but to those who come from me and come before me, forward and backwards. We work together. We embodied on the ancestors in their realm are working together. Not your dead, not the ghosts, ancestors. These are the people who are appointed, who are wise and have stepped into a particular role. These are the ones we speak of. Together, we are weaving a fabric and putting ourselves into a larger story. And all of this brings us into a re-indigenizing. Is then we begin to move our center of identity, the center of our world, away from the West, away from I think, therefore I am, into places where it is now I am because we are, that I'm no longer an individual, that my sense of who I am is in relationality. I'm a child when I'm in the room with an elder, and I'm an elder when I'm in the room with a child. And I'm not stuck in a rigid binary of identity. I am not stuck in my ability to be powerful and direct that power outside or inside. I'm not stuck in my embodiment that I can only be a warrior, or I can only be soft and delicate and dainty, that I can return to a wholeness that is known and unleashed best in my relationship to the spirits of the lands and waters, to my community, to my ancestors, and can be unleashed through service, through my purpose, through having been chosen to come here to bring a medicine to a people, a community, a village, and a world that needs it. Re-indigenizing, finding and reconstructing the stories of the way that the world can be and may have been outside of the one that we've been given. So this is now we are rebuilding not a world view, not one based on sight, but a world feel, a world fabric, a world sense. Now we have to change the way we know the world at large. And to do this may become another intellectual exercise for a time, and then another embodiment, and another grief work, and another ancestral work. And then the next step is that we must become students of elders. And then we must become elder students and student elders. We teach, each one teach one. We must continue to learn. We must continue to sit at the feet of wise ones while also embodying it to become those wise ones according to our own medicine. This becomes a way forward, because if we deconstruct without knowing what we are reconstructing, we will deconstruct ourselves out of a home and belonging, where we are now facing a society, a violent, terroristic society, without the tools necessary, without all of the support at our disposal. With ancestors alone, if you go back 16 generations, we're at over 100,000 possible relatives. Many of them are chosen and appointed to be part of our support team here. Spirits of land and water and trees and rocks, animals, all here to support us. We are not alone. Mycelium networks underground would show us that there is more to the story than what meets the eye. And there are interconnections and communications happening all the time to ensure that we can be here. We are truly never an individual. We are an amalgamation of so many influences, so many stories, so much love, so much complication to have arrived here in this moment. So we have to be clear that we are reconstructing a home, but not a home now based in exclusion, but a home that positions us as having a sense of belonging and importance based in serving through our medicine, through what was in us to bring, which means knowing ourselves and exploring ourselves becomes critical, not for the purpose of soul elevation, but so that we are whole people who can be a part of whole communities. The deconstruction must be complete, because if the systems that we're dealing with are not only based in the physical and are tearing us down at the very fabric of our spirit, then the remedy has to be just as robust as the poison. And in the West, the only tools we're given are intellectual tools, which never move us closer to the practices and strategies that our ancestors have left behind for us, if we should go find it and allow all of the senses, not just five, but all of the senses and ways of being to return to us, to explore, not in perfection, but in emergence, in right relationship, in reciprocity, in repair and reconciliation. There are elders who do this work. Malidoma Some's work exists. Sabonfu Some's work exists. Louisa Teich's work exists. There's so many people whose work exists to understand our spirit in wholeness, not just the spirituality and the physical separated, but in wholeness. And that we can take our understanding of the human and more than human world in wholeness, and we don't have to spiritually bypass the historical, social, political, and economic context in which we have this embodiment. And when we can do that, we can walk in the path of the freedom makers before us, who understood that they had at their disposal access to a power beyond just the physical, that informed the physical and allowed them to take bold, brave moves towards the reconstruction of whole societies and the deconstruction of grotesque ones. We don't do this work in a vacuum. We are part of a larger weaving around this. But the deconstruction journey, it doesn't involve grief, is incomplete and unreal. There's a huge grief to know that this is the society that we have wrought and been brought into. And this is the destruction that we are building a new society with. We've been given a massive amount of shit to compost. And the grief of that is perpetual. And in the dagger understanding, nature holds a lot of that grief because the ancestral spirits often live in nature. And spending time in nature allows us to connect to that grief that was never meant to be damned into shame or into deflection, into self-protection of an identity based in a system of exclusion and grotesque violence. But that the grief allows us to stay supple, to wash what was not ours, to find paths of reconciliation and restoration, which become critically important. That if we're not using force to move through, then we use the gentle force of water that has no enemies to reconcile that which otherwise could not be reconciled. I would love to invite you into this work if this is something that you're interested in doing with me. I have a year-long cohort for those who are racialized as white or in proximity to whiteness who want to deconstruct according to all the different elements that this deconstruction needs to take place in: ancestral reclamation, the intellectual knowledge that needs to happen to understand the historical context. Where have we been? Where are we going? What has already happened? This is part of ancestral work, mind you. Memory keeping is part of ancestral work, right? We cannot leave our memory keeping up to others and we don't become active in that as well, right? What is the reparations? What is the restoration that needs to occur? Or else we continue to stay out of balance. What is the shift in embodiment and practice, and how does that ripple out from us into our work, into our language, into our communities? And how do we become mother trees, act as hubs of communication, of resources, where we then become a place for others to share in the knowledge that we have, in the embodiment, in the wisdom, and our medicine can spread to help others become more whole, so we can build this world that needs to occur on top of the ashes of this one. That is a year-long cohort with me. If you're interested, you can write to me. And the other thing is that I have Radical Awakenings workshops, which are embodied. They are somatic, they are artistic, they are experiential, designed to get you into the body to really see what's in there beyond the intellectual posturing that happens around allyship. It's been extremely transformative. It is a very clear diagnostic of what's really happening in the body around how you're holding ideas. And often we haven't asked the body. We're stuck in the intellect, and the work needs to move into the other phases of grief, embodiment, ancestral practice. It needs to move into these other layers. So if you're interested in doing that work with me, Radical Awakenings, you can find that the link in my bio. The next ones are Sunday, June 5th and Sunday, July 7th from 2 to 5 p.m. I hope this helps. I hope this gives you a window into some of the deconstruction process. And I do have an ebook called Unearthing Whiteness, Radically Composting the Grooming by the Grotesque. It's pre-sale right now for $37. It'll launch at the end of June, at which point it'll be $49. But this is where I'll be formally putting in all these practices, rituals, methodologies, to really get to the root, which is what radical means, is we need to get to the root. We can't know what the medicine is until we get clear on what the wound is. And then we cannot stop there. We must find the medicine. I'd love to invite you all into continued deconstruction so we can meet under the baobab tree as spirits and watch our children play in a world that no longer has extraction, violence, and terror as its dominant ways of operating.